Good evening, this is Viewpoint. I'm Zakka Jacob. It's exactly a year to the day since the Galwan clashes in which 20 Indian soldiers died. An unknown number of Chinese soldiers were also killed. 1 year on, this is the reality on the ground. In Pangong So, around the lake, yes, there has been some amount of disengagement, but in the other areas where the Chinese had changed the status quo, they are simply refusing to go back to the pre-April 2020 status quo. So, how does India deal with it? Multiple rounds of talks at the co-commander level have happened, but other than Pangong, other areas, there seems to be, quote-unquote, a new normal. So, does India just simply learn to live with this? Or does India now push back, not just individually, but also try and build diplomatic pressure globally, much like what we saw in the G7 over the weekend? That and more we'll debate over the course of Viewpoint, but first, the story.
The LAC had largely been peaceful since the 1962 war. No soldier had lost his life in combat here in the last 45 years. 15th June 2020 changed that. At 7 p.m. that day, Colonel Santosh Babu, the commanding officer of 16 Bihar, along with 35 of his men, approached PP-14 to verify if the Chinese had vacated the post as agreed upon. They hadn't. This led to a verbal spat that soon escalated into a bloody brawl. As Colonel Babu's team removed Chinese tents, all hell broke loose. The Chinese attacked Colonel Babu and his men using iron rods wrapped with barbed wires, hockey sticks, stones and clubs. This bloodletting went on for 4 hours. By the time it was over, India had lost 20 soldiers. 10, including 2 majors and 2 captains, were taken hostage by the Chinese. Not a single shot had been fired.
अरे पी के पानी सिंध के खा के सौगंध मिट्टी के पी के पानी सिंध के शोला बन के बरसा अरे शोला बन के बरसा 16 बिहार पाप पे शत्रु पे पाप नष्ट किया.
Days after the clash, Prime Minister Modi made a surprise visit to a forward post in Ladakh and articulated the anger an entire nation was feeling.
मैं गलवान घाटी में शहीद हुए अपने वीर जवानों को भी पुनः श्रद्धांजलि अर्पित करता हूं.
In early July, the disengagement process started in the Galwan Valley, but it didn't progress in other areas. Then came a move that pushed China to the edge. On August 29th, in a surprise midnight move, Indian troops moved to occupy strategic heights on the south bank of Pangong So. It took control of ridgeline positions, dominating the heights and allowing it to keep an eye on Chinese military activity. In mountain warfare, he who occupies the heights dominates the battle. This was a huge pressure point for the Chinese, as their crucial Moldo base was in direct line of sight of Indian troops. It was a moment when India and China came very close to war, says Lieutenant General Y.K. Joshi, India's Northern Army commander.
31st, when the PLA wanted to come up, right up to the Kailash ranges, that was the time the situation was extremely tense. The Galwan had happened. Red lines had been drawn. So we have to be very clear that that's the time when a war was actually averted. We were on the edge. We were absolutely on the brink.
Left with little choice, China agreed to disengage. 10 months into the standoff, these videos of Chinese and Indian tanks disengaging in Pangong So had sparked hope that this was the beginning of the end. It wasn't. 4 months after these videos were taken, there has been no movement to resolve the standoff on other friction points like Gogra, Hot Springs, Demchok and Depsang. China has stalled the corps commander level talks. 60,000 troops continue to be deployed on either side of the LAC in Eastern Ladakh. There is stepped up deployment all across the LAC. The prophecy of the long haul has come true. In New Delhi, I'm Shreya Dhondial.
All right, on the talking point this evening, Praveen Swami is Group Consulting Editor with Network 18. Aina Tangent is a political affairs commentator joining us from Beijing. We'll also be joined by General Retired Ved Malik, who is the former Army Chief of the Indian Army, and we'll also be joined by K.C. Singh, former Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Praveen, I'll start with you. What is your best understanding of what has happened post the disengagement at Pangong? The understanding was that first it'll be Pangong, then the other areas, Chushul and Galwan and so on and so forth, but that hasn't quite happened. Why?
My best guess, in the absence of any clear statement from either side about exactly what it is they have been talking about, is that China has dug its heels in along where it feels its 1959 claim line, which, as you know, is its long asserted border, along where its 1959 claim line runs, and sees no compelling reason to vacate territory beyond that. Now, you're absolutely right, as you said in the report earlier, that India had been optimistic that following the early sort of de-escalation deal in Pangong, that there would be progress in the other areas. But some of us even then had predicted a long haul, and that's exactly what's happening. There's a stalemate. China clearly does not believe that stalemate is to its disadvantage, and is content to sit there for as long as it takes in the absence of any serious countervailing pressure.
Okay. General Malik is also through. General Malik, I was asking the same thing to Praveen Swami a moment ago. When the disengagement happened in Pangong a few months ago, the understanding was that they'll start with Pangong, and then in other places in Chushul, Depsang, Demchok, etc., there will be subsequent disengagement. But that hasn't happened. Praveen's best understanding is that a strategic stalemate, as it were, on the ground works to China's advantage, and that is why they're digging their heels in. Would you share that assessment? And if you do, then how does India break that strategic stalemate, which, according to him, suits China?
See, I agree with Praveen, because they were in the most vulnerable position when we had occupied Kalash Range, and that we have vacated in the hope that thereafter disengagement will take place in other sectors also. And as you said, it has not taken place. So the status quo before the status quo of the situation before Kailash Range incident in Galwan, Hot Spring, and Depsang in particular, that remains. So that means that the Chinese continue to occupy the situation, the ground that they had managed to occupy in May, June. So it is to their advantage, there is no doubt about it, and we lost the advantage of giving away Kailash Range. Now, stalemate can be broken by either diplomatic talks or through military action. I don't think that either China or India are prepared for a military action. I don't see that happening the way these occasional talks have taken place and messaging has taken place. And so we have to just hope for the diplomatic breakthrough sometimes. In the meantime, I believe that we will have to continue our extra troops which are deployed in that area. We have to remain alert. Incidentally, I must also mention that the Chinese have been improving their posture, and they've been carrying out training exercises, etc. So they have shown no lack of aggressiveness, and they continue to blame India for whatever happened in these areas. Okay. So I agree with the assessment that it is work to the Chinese advantage, and I believe that both India and China are looking forward to some kind of diplomatic breakthrough and not any military escalation.
One of the things that's happened, and not necessarily only because of Galwan or only because of the India-China clashes, K.C. Singh, I want to ask you this, is the world now, and I mean the US, UK, France, Germany, I mean just recently we had the G7, And if you look at the statement that they put out, they were critical of China about the origins of the coronavirus. They were critical on China with the whole Xinjiang situation and the treatment of Uyghurs on the Indian Ocean region. The whole gamut of issues in which the finger squarely pointed at China in a way that would have been, let's say, unimaginable, or people would have been tipping around toes 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Has that now changed? Is the world now firmly realizing and understanding that the Chinese are not going to just sit quiet? They are going to push the envelope. They are going to test the resolve of nations, whether it is neighbors, whether it is, big powers, and they want to essentially change the status quo. It's up to the world to decide whether they want to give China that opportunity or not.
I think we need to ask a reverse question. What were China's objectives last year? Of course, they thought that India is just beginning to feel the effect of the pandemic. The whole world was distracted. America was reeling. And we had Trump, who was really driving the nation literally, down a slope. And therefore, they could realize that no one's going to come to India's rescue. Remember that 1962 attack also took place as Soviet Union and the Americans were engaged over the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Chinese have this habit of utilizing strategic distraction of bigger powers to achieve some local effect. So what was their objective? Was it to control the territory or control a larger territory and have strategic advantage? To some extent, yes. Was it to push India to surrender? Well, surely they realized that India is not going to just turn over and play dead. Or was it just to embarrass India and therefore cut India down a notch and keep the pressure on India so that India does not converge with US and so on and so forth, because they didn't know how the US election may turn out. Now, a year later, general consensus is Chinese have not really gained strategically. They may continue to gain at a local advantage in Ladakh, in 4 places, Dapsang Plain, and 3 other places. But part of that is of our own making. Because the Prime Minister said right in the beginning, nobody's entered the country and nobody's intruded. Chinese just grabbed that and they said, look, we are not intruders. And then the Indian story, as was given out to the media, was these are legacy issues. The main thing was Pangang So, and therefore there the Chinese have gone back. So the story which was sold domestically, because Prime Minister's image as an ultra-nationalist and BJP's image as an avenging crusader had to be kept intact. But that story played to China's strength. Because if you say we've not been attacked, nobody's taken our land, Chinese said, fine, we never took anything. That's what you said. However, geostrategically, you're absolutely right. With G7, it began with Biden. President Joe Biden started where Trump left off. He did not soften the China policy. And G7 very clearly talks of climate change, talks of the Chinese challenge. So which means the European powers have also converged. That was always a weak spot. The Europeans were looking at China for trading. They were very difficult to have them adopt a more aggressive position on China. And a number of these navies, the French Navy, the British Navy, they're beginning to come to the Indo-Pacific. They're coming to the Pacific. So the Chinese position strategically, geostrategically, is not any better than it was. Actually, it's worse than it was a year ago. And therefore, that is why, why the demand has just come that they would like a meeting at a major general level. They've got the Chinese Communist Party meeting coming up. They know India is not about to attack them because we just about finished the second wave and we may be getting a third one. We ourselves are reeling, but it seems a much more, slightly more reasonable China than was there a year ago. Maybe they might decide that because the European and the American convergence is there, do they want all these forces to combine or should we start climbing down a bit?
So I want to ask Aina Tangent that because I think in China, again, just as the Chinese actions, not just in Galwan or at the LAC with India, other actions as well, the very belligerent and bellicose tone that they've taken, especially when Trump was in office on the trade wars with Australia, with Japan, on the territorial claims and so on and so forth. All of that seemed to have had the opposite effect for China globally, which is that the globe is now converging. Certainly the big powers are converging and realizing that China needs to be checked, or China needs to be told that some of its actions are unacceptable, some of its actions have consequences. So if the Chinese intention was to announce to the world that, here we are, we want the high table or the seat of power in the global high table, then it seems to have had the opposite effect. It's just scared everybody else away in a way that they are now coordinating their actions. So hasn't that turned out to be counterproductive, Einar Tangent? What's the view in Beijing?
Well, the view in Beijing is that this is a geopolitical struggle between an existing power, the U.S., and a rising power, China. And there are obviously tensions. These are like geo plates rubbing up against each other, tectonic plates, and there's a lot of grinding and noise. Hopefully there will not be any death or kind of wars that follow that. In terms of the world, the biggest issue now is that there's a lack of trust. China does not trust the U.S. It has 400 bases basically surrounding China, threatening its maritime trade, but then espousing this idea that somehow China would shut off maritime trade, which would be suicide for them. But that also affects India. India sees China as the four of you have aptly demonstrated. You see it as the villain, as the sole perpetrator, that India was acting completely in the right and China's completely in the wrong. But just let me give you what they see. When the maps were redrawn, when Kashmir was annexed, there were parts of it, these maps indicated areas that are occupied by China. And then in addition to that, you had a senior minister stand up in the Lok Sabha, your parliament, and say that he would not rest until all of that area was back in India's hands. Then you had the road building that was going on at a strategic location. It was not a civilian use. It's to link an air base to a supply area. And from the Chinese perspective, they began to wonder if this was a repeat of 62. There's going to be some sort of incremental attack. And that's what I'm saying. It's a lack of trust. The days when Pakistan and India joined the SCO, I'm just saying that this is their perspective.
No,
I'm not saying you have to agree.
Sure, I get that. But here's where the disagreement is, or here's where the flaw is in the Chinese perspective. Forget about what happened in Galwan, or forget about the LAC clashes. This is not just a US-China issue anymore. Today, after the G7, and this is just the latest illustration, after the G7 statement, it is the US, and on the US's side, you have other major powers from France and Germany and Britain, and here in Asia, you have Japan, India, Vietnam, Australia, all of them on one side up against China. That certainly is not what Xi Jinping would have had in mind if for all of these bellicose actions and the words that we've seen over the last many years. It's not just a 1 or 2 day event or a 1 or 2 month event. This has happened over a period of time. But now it's very clear. There's China on one side, and there's all the other big powers in the world on the other side.
Well, I think you're maybe over-exaggerating it. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of pressure being applied by the U.S. They did not get the statement that they wanted at the G7. They wanted something much more harsh, much more in line with what Biden was trying to do. But remember, I mean, a lot of this is domestically motivated. There's a desire to say, COVID and the resulting economic things are all China's fault, even if there were malfeasance and people saying very silly things, going with politics over science in many countries, including the ones at the G7 and the United States. The United States has still suffered the greatest amount, despite having its wealth and its medical system. So at this point, feelings are running very high. Everyone's looking for a scapegoat. China's there, but China is not alone. If you start looking at the economics, it's quite a different story. You hear this political rhetoric. It's very, very harsh. It's repeated by the international press. But money is pouring into China. The investment, it's just incredible. It's hit new records month after month. Foreign direct investment, money pouring into the markets and things like that. So on one hand, you hear all this political rhetoric, but the economic reality is quite different. And then if you start looking at ASEAN, which has now replaced the United States, it's the #1 area, things like that.
I get that. I'm sorry I'm having to interrupt because I want to give Praveen Swami the final word. It's not economic power or heft that the Chinese are after. They've got economic power and heft. I mean, they are the second biggest economy in the world, and they're fine, being thereabouts in the ballpark of the US in economic terms. What they want is political power. What they want is to be at the high table. What they want is what they call the G2, just America and China, and eventually. They want America to treat them as an equal power. But that being the plan, Praveen Swami, it's gone awry because it's now become, like I said, you've got all of these other major powers, and it's not just a Trump problem. I mean, Joe Biden is a Democrat, a middle-of-the-road Democrat. But today in America, China is seen as the enemy. China is seen today in America in mainstream politics the way the USSR was seen. So this is, for all practical purposes, as the famous FT Foreign Affairs editor said, this is the new Cold War. And it's up to China to choose how it wants to engage with the other powers. Surely it's not to China's advantage that India and Vietnam and Australia and Britain and France and Germany are all not on its side seemingly. They are on the other side. So the question is, if China was thinking that they can displace all other powers and they can be equals with the United States, their actions over the last 4 or 5 years to achieve that objective have basically backfired, have turned out to be counterproductive. Final word to you, Praveen, on your assessment of not just what happened in Galwan, but these actions over the last 4 or 5 years.
Enemies across the globe in a very short time. But I'm afraid what Einar has said may be closer to the truth than we imagine. This idea of a new Cold War descending on the world is an interesting one. It's a widely used metaphor, but it's not an appropriate one. The Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s and 90s was not plugged into the global economy. Major European economies were not enmeshed with it. Through the 80s and 90s, it was a declining economic and military power. China is the exact opposite. And however sort of nice the language of the G7 communique is, the fact is the United States isn't jacking up its naval expenditure to compete with the Chinese. It wants to keep a technology gap. It wants to protect certain enclaves of its technological supremacy. But nobody in Europe or the United States is going to step up, into a conflict or a trade war with China on India's behalf because of something that is happening in the Himalayas. So I really think the lesson of this year is that India needs to step back, assess its options and global reality in an unemotional and clinical way. And when we say prepare for the long haul, genuinely prepare for the long haul. It's not just a question of having troops over there, for the next 5 years or 10 years. It's a question of rethinking what India's place in the region and the world is actually going to be, given the extraordinary and dramatic rise of China since 2008. And this is something we have probably not applied our minds enough to, and probably need to start doing now on a quite urgent basis, because this problem is not going to go away anytime soon.
Thanks for joining us. We're getting a piece of breaking news, and this has got to do with Punjab politics. We're just getting in this piece of breaking news that the Congress's MP from Ludhiana, Ravneet Bittu, today was booked by the Punjab police. Away what he called biased speech, quote-unquote biased speech, like Anandpur side and Chapur side, to the Bahjan Samaj Party, the BSP. Essentially, the BJP and Mr. Harpreet Puri, the attacking Bittu and the Congress of being anti-Dalit. Let's try and listen in. All right, we don't have the bite of Mr. Bittu. Let me go across to Tejinder and ask him for more details on this, Tejinder.
ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਵਿੱਤਰ ਧਰਤੀ ਤਖਤ ਸਾਡਾ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਨੰਦਪੁਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਉਹ ਸੀਟ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਅਨੰਦਪੁਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟ ਹਲਕੇ ਚੰਦੂ ਮਾਜਰਾ ਦੀ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਸੀਟ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਬੀਐਸਪੀ ਨੂੰ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਫਿਰ ਸਾਡੀ ਪਵਿੱਤਰ ਧਰਤੀ ਸਾਹਿਬਜ਼ਾਦਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਚਮਕੌਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਅਨੰਦਪੁਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਸੀਟ ਚ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਚੰਦੂ ਮਾਜਰਾ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਉਹ ਚਮਕੌਰ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਸੀਟ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਪਵਿੱਤਰ ਸੀਟਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਸੀਟਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਬੀਐਸਪੀ ਨੂੰ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ
See, the Congress Party member Parliament from Ludhiana, Ravneet Bittu, has been booked at, and the cases have been filed in various police stations across Punjab. It began yesterday evening when Ravneet Bittu posted a video on his Facebook page where he accused the Shiromani Akali Dal, as per Ravneet Bittu, quote unquote, wherein he said that the pious seat has been deserted by the Shiromani Akali Dal. He termed that the Chamkor Sahab and Anandpur Sahab seats, the pious seat as per Mr. Bittu has been given to Bahujan Samaj party. You know, just a couple of days ago, both the parties, the Shiromani Akali Dal and the BSP, they signed an agreement how to fight the upcoming assembly elections in Punjab, wherein both the parties, they agreed that BSP will contest on 20 seats across Punjab, and both the seats, the Anandpur Sahab seat, which has a large number of Dalit votes, and also the Chamkor Sahab, which is also having a large number of Dalit seats, have been given to the BSP. Now the Congress Party MP from Ludhiana, Mr. Bittu, last night posted that video. After that, there has been large scale protest across Punjab by the BSP workers. They have said that the Congress Party has been saying that the Dalits don't have the right to contest, quote unquote, from the pious seats, these two pious seats. So clearly the protests are going on, and owing to that, FIR has also been lodged at
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much. We'll see how the story plays out. Thanks very much for tuning in. I'll catch you again at 9 o'clock with Cross Time.